In this episode, we're going to continue on in the Pentecostal History series, and we're going to have a look at a man by the name of Frank Bartleman and the mission field. I'm Jason, and this is the Aussie Berean. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Aussie Berean. Now, we're still continuing through the Contemporary Pentecostal History, and last week we finished up with Frank Bartleman's eyewitness accounts of the controversy surrounding William Durham and William Durham's teaching on sanctification, which separated the Pentecostal movement for quite a bit of time. So if you're not up to date and you're listening for the first time, I invite you to go back to episode 50 first, because that's where it started. Now, as the Pentecostal movement is drastically different today than how it began, some opinions and conclusions that I might come to in this episode or future episodes might seem a little bit off base or unwarranted without the context of the previous two episodes. Now, the names mentioned may also be new to you, because generally speaking, these people aren't really spoken about unless you have looked into this history for yourself. Now, of course, while you go back to episode 50, hit the bell and the subscribe button wherever you listen so that you don't miss each new episode when it's released. So let's recap and do a little... We'll pick up where we left off on the last one, but we'll do a little bit of a recap first. So William Seymour, and this is a big paraphrase. So William Seymour met a man named Charles Parham, and he picked up Parham's teaching on baptism in the Spirit during a time of racial segregation. He then moved to Los Angeles to preach this message and was baptized in the Spirit himself, and started a small gathering which grew and became known as the Azusa Street Mission. His message became the unity of all people of all races under Christ, with a heavy leaning towards holiness. His leadership was challenged by Charles Parham quite a few times, actually, because of ecstatic praise and worship and the mixing of blacks, whites, and Hispanics in the same congregations. Seymour broke fellowship with him, and Azusa Street continued on in a large success. William Durham then visited Azusa and was baptized in the Spirit himself, and was given the platform as a fill-in preacher while Seymour was away. Durham preached a sermon on finished work sanctification, requiring no prerequisites from the believer to receive Spirit baptism, which opposed William Seymour's strict teaching on entire sanctification, requiring the believer to come to a state of holiness before Spirit baptism was possible. Seymour's wife then locked Durham out of the church until Seymour returned, at which time both Seymour and Durham sat down and discussed theology, but eventually broke fellowship over this difference, creating the movement's first schism. Now, the movement was split, right, with half of its followers leaving Azusa to follow Durham's message, whose ministry grew exponentially until its followers took an extreme view of sanctification and disregarded seeking holiness altogether. Frank Bartleman visits Azusa Street and receives baptism in the Spirit, shattering his cessationist views, and begins ministry alongside Durham. Durham, of course, receives a lot of flack as the position's leader due to his followers' extreme abuse of his teaching, leading him to consider retaliating against the persecution that he received, which then led Bartleman to step down away from Durham's platform and go his own way. Charles Parham came back to Los Angeles and publicly prayed that whoever was wrong in their teaching of sanctification between himself and Durham would be smited by God, to which he boasted of himself being correct after Durham caught a cold, leading to pneumonia, and ultimately his death shortly after. And this is where we finished last week, with Bartleman's retelling of Durham's humility and restraint, despite the heavy persecution and the finished work sanctification doctrine, and how Durham taught it originally. It was based on Christ's work instead of our own. Now, this was around 1912, not long before the beginning of World War I. So what happens next, basically? Like, what happened to Frank Bartleman? Who started leading this movement after Durham passed away? Well, there's no real answer to that because this movement was no longer localized. Now, it's very hard to find a consistent timeline, but one thing remains the same. Every major article on Azusa Street and on the Pentecostal movement uses Frank Bartleman's books and references as the main source for their articles. And they also reference him as playing a big role. Now, Bartleman wasn't really considered the next leader or the next guy in the Pentecostal movement, but what he did for the Pentecostal movement is worth this episode. So let's go back a little bit further first, because nearly every Pentecostal that I've ever met says that Azusa was the start of Pentecostalism, Azusa was an exclusive event, and William Seymour was its sole leader. However, God was doing work in quite a few places at the same time, and one of those works was in a church that Frank Bartleman attended, which was called the First Baptist Church of Los Angeles. Now, a man by the name of Joseph Smale pastored that church, and he'd only recently returned from a trip to Wales around 1905 in the American summer, and that was roughly 6 months before Azusa Street started. Now, whilst Joseph Smale was in Wales, he attended meetings during the Great Welsh Revival, where whole entire towns experienced an outpouring of the Spirit. He witnessed countless amounts of people come to repentance and turn towards God, and he prayed earnestly for God to do the same thing in Los Angeles. Now, upon returning to Los Angeles, Smale opened up his church for daily intercessory prayer. Now, countless amounts of people hungry for revival joined in these prayer meetings, specifically praying for a new Pentecost. Now, Frank Bartleman was one of those people. You see, God times things so perfectly, right? Which is something that I recently witnessed myself on a smaller scale. But Bartleman's 3-year-old daughter had recently gotten ill and passed away, which led him to rededicate his life to God, leading him ultimately to these meetings. Now, sometimes in our own lives, we go through the misfortunes and troubles of things like this, right? Illnesses and untimely deaths of loved ones, which in the moment, we can become self-absorbed and often filled with despair or anxiety. And it's only in hindsight that we can see this unfortunate event happened for the greater good. Now, we all recite Romans 8:28, right, which is all things happen for the greater good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. But do we believe it? Now, when strife comes, are we patiently waiting to see God's plan play out? Or are we complaining and whining about our own inconveniences? Just something to have a little bit of a think about. Now, after strong opposition from the other Baptist leaders in the area, Joseph Smale was forced to resign as the pastor of his church. So he simply just formed a new congregation and named it the New Testament Church of Los Angeles. Now, this comment that I just made about him simply forming a new church might be a bit cringeworthy for a Catholic or an Orthodox listener. However, he was forced from his position because the Baptist leaders didn't like the spontaneous call to prayer. It was literally just as simple as that. Now, the source for this is page 4 of the March 11, 1916 issue of the Pentecostal Evangel, which is a newspaper, and it was in Frank Bartleman's own words. And the link for that is in the show notes. Now, I understand that in other traditions, a petition to leadership is required and then an approval from said leadership before a pastor could call for corporate prayer. However, in Protestantism, we don't have those sorts of traditions and believe God to be the final authority. If the Holy Spirit is undoubtedly leading us to do something or calling us to prayer or ministry, then we listen and obey God rather than men. And when I undoubtedly, right? When I say undoubtedly, I mean literally that. So a little bit of discernment would need to happen. Obviously, God's not going to make a call for everybody to sell everything they own and go into poverty, right? I'm going to leave it there because I could go on a big rant. But anyway, I can see a Catholic or Orthodox argument to delegitimize this pastor as simply just another Protestant becoming his own pope. And that's fine, right? I'm just trying to follow this movement and piece together what actually happened. Now, it's not a dig at anyone at all. Like, I'm not trying to belittle the Orthodox or the Catholic churches. I just know that Nick would bring it up in our next phone conversation if it wasn't addressed here. Now, Bartleman recounts that there were people and leaders from all kinds of denominations attending these meetings for weeks, with many healings and spontaneous worship. Now, this all happened up until roughly spring in 1906, which is basically the same time that Azusa Street started. Now, I can gather as well that if we follow the backstories of any name that we read about in the Azusa recounts, their stories will all be similar. Okay, revival isn't an instantaneous thing. Okay, there is a build-up and a time of testing that leads up to it. Now, this pastor, Joseph Smale, he went against the grain of the Baptist beliefs in the area. And he was urged to stop by them, but he made the choice to follow after God and not man. Now, he'd lost his position as a Baptist pastor in his endeavour to seeking God. Now, there was times of fervent fasting, fervent prayer, and intense worship before the Spirit was poured out. Now, in that same issue of the Pentecostal Evangel magazine, Frank Bartleman tells of how he lost many nights' sleep to ongoing prayer, wrestling for the souls of the lost around him. It's just a really great read, and it is eye-opening. Now, there is another thing that, while I was researching, and I haven't written it down, but it was another thing that I found about Joseph Smale. So when he left this church, when he was forced out of this church and he formed his own church, he actually became very absorbed in the church itself and setting it up. And it's believed that he lost the point of what he was doing. He lost the drive for the revival. And he put all of his energy into building this church. And quite a few people actually walked away. So now we come back to 1912, right, just prior to the death of William Durham, and we'll have a look at what happened with the rest of Frank Bartleman's story. So after leaving Durham's platform, Bartleman headed to the old upper room, which had just been reopened under the leadership of a man named Warren Fisher. Now, it was here that Bartleman was asked to deliver a sermon, and eventually became the pastor there with a very strong ministry. Now, during his time there, William Durham died, and Bartleman felt the Lord calling him again to the mission field after he'd had one short trip a couple of years earlier to China in 1910. And he felt a strong conviction for Europe while passing through on that trip. So he finally headed there for a period of around about 2 years. I think it was about a month, just shy of 2 years. Now, for those interested, the source for this information comes from Chapter 8 of Frank Bartleman's 1925 book, How Pentecost Came to Los Angeles. And it was renamed in the 1980s to Azusa Street. And some more resources that I've used is the Dictionary of Pentecostal History on the Internet Archive's website. Now, both of these are also linked in the show notes. Now, if you visit the Internet Archives link, it will ask you to pay for viewing, but you can use the search button instead, type in Bartleman, and it will bring up every page that has his name on it, free of charge. Now, Bartleman went to the mission field completely reliant on God. Funding to start the mission came from outside of LA and paid for the first stop to Denver. Now, Bartleman notes in his book, I also want to let you guys know that a lot of this episode is going to be quoting from Bartleman's books, because the words that he uses and the way that he describes it, trying to put them into my own words would not have done it justice. So anyway, Bartleman notes in his book, he says, "Today you are okay, tomorrow you may be standing on your head with them. So it is better to at least look to God. Our poor missionaries on the foreign field hardly know where they stand in relation to most of the missions. Before the next letter can pass between them, the whole doctrinal situation may be changed, or the society have totally dissolved for that matter. They need our sympathy and our prayers. When will God's people become one flock with one shepherd, Jesus, as he has promised? It is surely time to pray as Jesus prayed, that they all may be one, that the world may believe." So there was already controversies, right, in a large part by the sounds of it. But we're going to be looking at some of those in the next episode. I was going to try and add them into this one, but once again, this one and that one will both be large episodes. So I kind of skim-read through this episode and I was like, man, I still have 2 chapters of this book to go through and it's already going to be about an hour. So I didn't want to bore you guys with 2 hours because it's a lot of information in one episode. So after Denver, Bartleman travelled through Europe between 1912 and 1914. Now, him and his companions went through England, Scotland, Wales, Holland, Switzerland, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and finally Russia, where he, in his own words, preached in secret under the Tsar's nose. I don't know if it's Tsar or Tsar. So under the Tsar's nose, and that's in his own words. Now, there's a bit of discrepancy, though, because some articles say that he went alone. Some say that he took his family. But in his own documenting of this period, he makes it clear that his family was with him. Now, this 2-year missions work is documented in great detail in a book which is, funnily enough, titled 2 Years Mission Work in Europe. And yes, you guessed it, it's also linked in the show notes. Now, this one, I think I have a link for both the Apple version and a free PDF version. Now, the PDF version is very hard to read, so I suggest if you don't have an Apple iPhone, you're going to have to use the PDF. But if you have an iPhone, go and get it on ebooks. Now, Bartleman actually stayed in Europe all the way and a little bit past the day that the war was declared by Britain, which started the First World War. Now, he documents the entire 2-year trip in kind of like a diary entry type format. He seems to have spent quite a bit of time in Finland and Sweden, who were quote-unquote friendly countries at the time, before leaving his family in, I think, Finland for a little bit. I've put Sweden in here, but I don't think it was Sweden because I'm pretty sure it was Finland. But he left them there anyway to head into Russia. Now, while he was in Russia, Bartleman talks about how the Greek church, which is the Orthodox church, basically wrote the laws there, and how evangelism had to be done in secret because it was against the Russian laws at the time. And anyone caught evangelizing outside of the Greek Orthodox church would be imprisoned. Now, here's a quote from the book. It says, "We were questioned closely as to what our business was in the city, but we simply stated that we were there to see the city, which was a part of the truth, and all we naturally dared to divulge to them. We were obliged to be very guarded in our movements. If we were caught preaching, it meant a Russian prison. We passed the political prison on the way to our hotel. It was a mean-looking place called St. Peter's and St. Paul's. I imagine it was almost as bad as some that they had been incarcerated in their time. A Russian prison is a foul affair. We had a hard battle at first in the meetings, but towards the last we broke through. There was much fear of the authorities on the people, and the power of the Greek church was mighty. We had to fear both the authorities and the Greek church. In fact, the Holy Synod practically made the laws and constituted the authority in Russia. I was first translated into Swedish, then into Icelandish. Most of those who attended the services were Icelanders. We prayed for many. Some were healed and saved, and the saints were generally built up and encouraged. The police did not find us. Even their own subjects were not allowed by law to preach the gospel to any other congregation but their own. This cut out evangelism altogether. We were in St. Petersburg 4 days and held 5 meetings. It was impossible to remain longer without being discovered and imprisoned. So to avoid imprisonment, they toured around St. Petersburg by day, and they entered into house churches or home gatherings by night. And these houses were inside courtyards with iron gates. They had thick, heavy curtains drawn across the windows, and there was guards at each of the gates. Now, this is on page 45 to 47 of the ebook. And this book really is a fantastic read and eye-opening to the world of evangelism and the mission field. Now, some people believe a missions trip, right, to be a visit to a third world country, staying in a hotel, and travelling by an air-conditioned car into the jungle through a pathway cut out for them. I mean, look, even myself, right, I always understood the mission field to be an extremely dangerous place where someone needs to have complete faith in God to see them through it. But reading through this book, even gradually in parts at a time, it's very confronting and it's quite convicting. And it shows how even that sort of thinking is still nowhere even near the depth. It really emphasizes how distant modern evangelism and Pentecostalism in general is from its roots. But sincerely, get this book and read it. Right? There's dreams and visions. God's provision is evident. In fact, it's forefront. His providence is evident. There's healings, there's deliverances, there's miracles scattered all throughout the book. You won't be disappointed. It's $1.99. Like, it's $2, man. People spend more on coffee. So anyway, next up, Bartleman goes back to Stockholm to see his family. Well, Stockholm is in Sweden, so I guess his family did actually stay in Sweden for a little bit. So he goes back to Stockholm to see his family. He's been away from them for around about 5 weeks, but how's that relevant, right? So it's not relevant to the Pentecostal historical side, but it shows that sometimes when evangelizing, wisdom is needed, right? Because I don't know if you were able to follow that, right? So before he went into Russia, he left his family there because Russia was a dangerous place. So he didn't just take his family into Russia, right? Now, sometimes we might hear it said that we should trust God going into the dangerous mission fields and then go as a family in full faith, right? But I don't believe that's wise, because whilst it's great to evangelize as a family, it was only him who had this calling. His wife didn't have this calling, right? And it would have been really cruel to subject her and his children to the potential dangers. Now, I'd like to note that while it's taught in Scripture to be full of faith, it's also told not to put the Lord to the test, right? Which Jesus famously told the devil in Matthew 4:7, quoting Deuteronomy 6:16. Now, going with faith in obedience is completely different to going with faith in arrogance, right? Do you get what I mean? So the first says, I don't want to go, but God is calling me to go, and I will have faith in him. But the second is, I want to go because I'm a child of God, and he will make sure that I'm fine. So one is obedience, and the other is in arrogance, right? Now, anyway, upon returning to his family, there's another quote, and I want to mention it. It doesn't really have anything to do with the story, but I want to mention it because it just kind of shows his heart. Now, so in his own words, it says, I received a letter from Libby, Montana, with a $5 bill in it. There was not a scratch of a pen to tell who it came from. Nothing but the bill in the letter. But God brought it through safely. He will reward the giver. That was true scriptural giving. I received $12 from an old coloured lady in New England, 65 years old. She had saved 25 cents a week from the money that she got from selling eggs from her chickens. The money that she sent me was from her year's tithing from this income. What a reward such givers will receive from God, the widow's mite. Now, he didn't ask for these types of things, right? They just kept coming in. But I love that he acknowledges these kind of people who freely and joyfully gave for the advancing of the kingdom of God. It's an encouragement to everyone who reads. And I have no doubt that once my church has partnered with missionaries, we would do the same. But I am also a little bit biased on my church because we are just a great group of people, you know. Now, just before he goes into Russia for the last time, he talks of remembering a circle vision. That's the only way to describe it, a circle vision that God had given him. And he kept on preaching on it everywhere he went. However, unlike many of today's prophets who are so sure of themselves and get it wrong, Bartleman describes feeling like he had missed the mark constantly when he was preaching it. But then as the book is written after the war, he's able to see in hindsight the providence of God. So from his book, it says, that is undoubtedly why the Lord gave me such a solemn feeling about my commission in this connection, when he first showed me the circle I was to take. Before we had moved to Sweden, I remember prophesying of a great war when we passed through Amsterdam on the way to the continent from England. I pictured the whole thing out, telling them just what part Little Holland would be destined to play in it. She was to stand between the wild beast forces, the nations, a haven of refuge. At that time, I was tempted over this message also, and wondered what made me give it. I was afraid they would lose faith in me altogether. But when we came through en route for home, after the World War had started, all that I had prophesied had come true. Now, when it comes time to getting into Russia again, Bartleman emphasizes just how dangerous it is. He really does emphasize how much the Orthodox Church was influential to the government of the day and how outlawed it was for a foreigner to preach the gospel. But I don't want to spend a lot of time simply reciting books in these episodes. But as I said at the top of the show, I really can't find better words than the words that he used himself. Now, reading the books is like being there with him. And I think that's the point. He's detailed every single dollar given to him, every location, no matter how insignificant, every person he interacted with, every pastor, preacher, interpreter, and guide that were there with him. In my opinion, this actually shows humility and accountability. He's showing that he relied on whatever was given him in the moment. There was no planning and foreknowledge, no orchestration, just simply God's provision. Now, I know some people might lose interest in this history as soon as they hear about dreams and visions or healings or tongues, and I get it, okay? We kind of think of healing ministries as big dollar makers, right? With preachers in mansions caring more about a show than following up with the people that they lay hands on. But just have a listen to this quote from Bartleman's book. He says, "At times, the hall was packed almost to suffocation. So many wanted hands laid on them for healing that many times I left the meeting wet through with perspiration and completely exhausted. A number were healed, some saved, and some filled with the Spirit. The ventilation was very poor in the meetings. Finland is a land surrounded by water and full of lakes. The beds are always damp when one crawls into them. I contracted much rheumatism and congestion from this. I suffered much from lumbago." Now, lumbago is just severe low back pain, but hear what he says here, right? Everywhere he went was like this. Crowds and crowds constantly came forward for prayer and to have hands laid on them. And then even when exhausted, he just keeps going. Now, does any of our televangelists and big convention preachers ever do this today? Or do they just simply cut the show short so that they can rest? You know, Bartleman is not just some snake oil salesman. You know, he's genuine, and he documents everything. Now, when lots get healed, he writes that. when only a couple get healed? He writes that. And then furthermore, he revisits a lot of these places, right, which kind of should really tell us that these were legitimate healings. Because if they weren't, he wouldn't have been welcomed back, right? Now, I'm only giving you snippets of this book in this episode, but reading it in its entirety is gripping, right? And these snippets, while great themselves, they really don't do the story justice. So anyway, back to Russia, right? He arrives in St. Petersburg on the 23rd of May, 1914, literally 1 month before the events that trigger World War I start. They held 8 meetings over 6 days, and at this time it was against the law for a foreigner to preach the gospel in Russia. However, Bartleman notes that whilst Finland was also under Russian law, it was far more relaxed there. Now, they visited the same mission they had visited before, but this time the congregants were mostly Russian, which made their time extremely dangerous. Some of these congregants were still part of the Greek Orthodox Church, which Bartleman again emphasises that they practically made all of the laws in quote-unquote Holy Russia at this point in time. Now, I do want to note, though, that after World War I, the Greek Orthodox Church there lost their influence in the state. It was around about 1917 because the political leader had changed, and the guy that came in could not be influenced by the Greek Church. Now, a few years later, they suffered extremely heavy persecution under Joseph Stalin from 1928 all the way up until the Second World War. Now, back to Bartleman. So generally, when he preached, he was translated into 3 languages, but on this visit, he was translated straight from English into Russian. This is another quote from his book about these meetings. He says, "Many souls were blessed, some were saved and healed. The people fairly thronged us for prayer. When we gave the invitation at the end of the service, practically the whole congregation passed to the front and knelt. We had to push them back, instead of seeking to drag them forward as we did in America. We hardly had room to move around among them." And then have a listen to some of the extremes that they went through to even make it possible to hold these meetings. He says admission to the meetings was by ticket only. The leaders arranged that plan. They were afraid of spies. They had a brother stationed at the outer gate to the court and another one on the inner door. The meetings sometimes lasted for hours. The people came in 2 or 3 at a time, so to avoid suspicion. And then they went out the same way after the meeting. The doors were fast, the windows were all closed tight with curtains drawn to avoid the possibility of discovery by the police. Our meetings were held only a few blocks from the Tsar's Winter Palace and almost within the shadow of the Holy Synod buildings, where the Greek Church made all its intolerant religious laws. One night they hurried us out of the back door into the alley. The iron gate at the street had suddenly been locked by the police, and the brethren thought that they were after Brother Smith and myself, but it turned out they were after someone in the hotel in the front. There were many buildings in the square court in which our mission room was located. The walls themselves were about 4 feet thick. Kind of convicting, isn't it? You know, because we're here in the Western world. Right, we've got hot water for showers, literally on tap. We have freedom to speak about Jesus to anybody at any time. We can worship freely and we can practice our faith, but do we? Like, do we get the gravity here? You know, like these guys had to sneak around, you know, in the darkness of night, facing extremely dangerous jail cells and heavy persecution from people who were supposed to be our brothers. They were under gated and guarded courtyards, with curtains drawn in the windows and services going for hours on end to the point of exhaustion for the privilege to preach the gospel with signs, wonders and miracles following, seeing thousands coming to repentance and faith in Christ. Like, I'm preaching to myself here as well, right? Because I know that I am extremely lazy, right? It's like, sure, I might do this podcast, I might study scripture and all of that sort of things, but I mean, how often do I share the gospel, right? It's not nowhere near as much as I should be. Now, anyway, so back to Bartleman again. So whilst he was in this particular meeting, he was brought a local lady to receive deliverance. Now, she was a member of the Orthodox Church and had been demonized for 7 years. He tells how she was regularly prostrated and bedridden from this demon, and then goes on to describe around about a half-hour battle with the demon before it left her. And he had heard from her a month later, before he left for Finland, and he says that she was still delivered and still following Christ. Now, I don't want to be rude, nasty, or judgmental here, but this lady was in this way in the Greek church for 7 years, and no one in the Orthodox Church delivered her? Like, surely we have to assume that it was at least tried or attempted, right? Or do we just assume that this particular church at this particular time in history was just not doing their job? Now, without more information, it is unwise to comment either way. But at the end of the day, this lady received victory from Bartleman's ministry, not her own church, in this area of her life. Now, the last interesting bit of information Bartleman writes about is the Orthodox Church and the local authorities having tolerance for the Muslims in the area, but not the evangelicals. Now, he notes of a Muslim mosque and how glorious it was built and adorned. He said that it was one of the most beautiful buildings in the area, covered in mosaics and able to hold thousands of worshippers. Now, he does note that he also visited a number of Orthodox cathedrals, and one in particular was where the Tsar worshipped. I think the Tsar is the Russian leader. Now, I know it's another jab at the Russian Greek Orthodox Church, but it goes to show that no matter how much this movement was doing in the name of Christ, the fruit was never going to be looked at from a tree that the Greek Church considered to be severed. Now, he goes on to say his passport had expired, and he went to the American consul to have it renewed just prior to leaving the city. This would have also been difficult because tensions were rising, right? There was anticipation of war by this time. Now, foreigners would have found it hard moving in and out of places, which we'll find out shortly. And all of this info is on pages 57 to 59 of his book, 2 Years Mission Work in Europe. Now, after getting back to his family in Finland, he went to Lahti for a Bible conference. Now, I'm not talking about latte. It's a place called Lahti. It's Lahti. And he says this in his book. He says, I left Abo for Lahti with the family, June 17th, 1914, for a 2-week Bible conference. I preached 10 times during the session there. There were leaders there from all over Finland, Russia, and Sweden. We had about 400 delegates in all. Many of these dear people slept on the bare floor with only a blanket. Meals were on the free will offering plan. All expenses were met in this way, and there was some to spare. The people gave very liberally from their poverty. God honoured the stand of faith. It was scriptural order. Now, from Lahti, now I'm going to butcher this next name, and I know that Cindy Droz is probably going to laugh at me for it. But from Lahti, they visited a place called Helsingfors, a place that they'd been many times before. And they hopped on a train to Hango and then jumped on a boat on their way into Lübeck, Germany, where they arrived on the 3rd of July, 1914. He spoke at a small Pentecostal conference in Bremen on the 17th of July, 1914, and he recalls one of his sermons being prophetic. Now, in his own words, he says, I remember telling them that the Germans were the iron that was left out of the old Roman Empire, but that they would have to be broken and put through the fire before God could use them as he wanted to. They were too strong in themselves. Little did I realize that in 2 short weeks that very thing would come to pass, and that they would be plunged into the terrible world war, with practically the whole world against them. But it so proved. Now, he spoke a few more times in Bremen and stayed there until war was declared on August the 1st. He had an appointment in a place called Bundy on that night, and it was right near the border to Holland, around about 3 hours away, I think. And he actually didn't understand what war really meant. Now, in Bremen, he said it was a very relaxed and peaceful giving, right? There was no anxiety of war. But as he got closer to Bundy, he started to realize the gravity of war. Now, what should have been a 3 to 4 hour trip, it took about 7 hours, and there was a checkpoint in which they had to change cars. Now, he noticed the police were patrolling and they were looking for spies who, when they caught them, they beat them. Now, it was at this point that he started getting concerned. Now, one policeman approached him and started a conversation because he'd seen him a year earlier preaching. Now, how scary would that have been, right? So you see cops throwing out beatdowns and suddenly one of them just wants to come and have a chat with you. Like he starts walking towards you. You know, have you ever been sort of pulled aside by Border Patrol at the airport? Now, I can't relate. I haven't because I've never flown and I don't really have the desire to. But I know people who have. And, I mean, even the most innocent of people still get anxious. Now, once he made it to Bundy, which was 3 miles from the Holland border, he says that that was as far as the trains travelled. The line into Holland had been broken to prevent Germany from using it. He goes on to talk about the day the war was declared in Britain and the mad rush to get to the border of Holland, which at that time remained a neutral state, just as he'd prophesied it would. However, getting inside and outside the borders was close to impossible. And then when they finally did get in, the trains out of the country were transporting troops and closed to the public. Now, he talks about the morale of the people there. Right? He said, you know, nobody works the fields and no one was working in their jobs. And the young men were the first to be sent to the French border. Page 64 and 65 of his book says this: all the young men were leaving Bundy from the neighbourhood around Ostfriesland. They were the first troops... Sorry, I have to laugh at the way I'm pronouncing some of these words. Forgive me if you're from these places and you're listening. They were the first troops to be sent to the French border. Those were harrowing times. All work was at a standstill. The harvest was left standing in the fields. No one had any heart to work. For a week or more, until the troops were moved, no work was done. The whole village lived at the railway station, watching the trains pull out that carried their loved ones to death and destruction. Pastor Vogay and myself held meetings alone in the little Pentecostal hall, as a regular conference was out of the question. We preached to the men who came to the meetings for the last time. Many came who would not come before. They were about to face death, and their hearts were sober. I am satisfied more than one found Christ just in time. In a few days, some of them were into eternity. And that's quite sobering, really. You know, his family was still in Bremen, and he reached them after a few more days. He talks about how slow the train ride home was, you know, even though home at this time was not his own country. He says the trains went slowly and carefully over bridges and through tunnels, and the people of the country were outdoing each other with kindness towards the troops on the trains. So there was endless supplies of milk and sandwiches and eggs and every type of food, and they gave it out freely. And he was actually brought to tears at the display of love and kindness. He says that he could have had whatever food he desired until he was full, but he chose not to even take a single morsel of food because he felt that he was making no sacrifice of his own. Now, the humility, right? Just wow, right? Just wow. So from here, Bartleman and his family stayed in Bremen for a few weeks. Now, he didn't want to leave until he was certain that it was God's will, despite being urged to leave by the American consul, who told him that they couldn't guarantee protection for him and his family. He says that he preached in the now small Pentecostal mission there, being that the majority of the men had been sent into war, and for them, not going to war meant death for refusal. The 9th of September 1914 was his last time in Bremen before he headed into Amsterdam. He says that it was extremely difficult to get a ship out of Amsterdam and decided that if it was God's will for him to head home to America, a spot would open up for him and his family. He stayed in Amsterdam a few days and preached twice on the Sunday. Whilst attempting to find a ride home, he found out that there was about a 6-week wait. About a 6-week wait as all the boats were filled. And then he recalls this. No, actually, go and read the book. Okay, it's on pages 71 to 74. And it shows the timing and the providence of God in a great way. Again, this book is like $2 Australian on iBooks, man. All right. The link's there in the show notes. Go and read pages 71 to 74 to find out what happened there, because it's just beautiful. Anyway, after this amazing passage back to his family, he was able to move them safely and without issue from Bremen in Germany into Amsterdam in Holland. He'd been given a military passport, which helped greatly with the rest of his travels. He stayed in Amsterdam a short time with a Pentecostal family, preaching in the small mission whilst he was there, before securing a boat out of Holland. Now, he talks a bit about wanting to remain in Europe and wrestling back and forth with God about returning to America, but, ultimately he yielded to the will of God rather than his own. But he didn't get straight home yet, right? There were stops along the way, and the travelling was by daylight only. And it was very slowly because the German submarines were everywhere. Now, I've played a lot of war games before, okay, before I was a Christian. And I've watched a lot of military movies. But I just can't fathom what this experience was like. Every single moment wondering if you would be blown out of the water and wind up in a watery grave. Now, I'm not talking of Bartleman, of course, because he had God's assurance of returning home. But every other soul on those boats, man, like the anxiety, it would have been extreme. It would have been huge. So he makes his way through Europe and he gets to London, where he said the mood was very, very tense. He recalls shop fronts with signs that say war on German trade and death to German trade. And anyone who refused to display these signs was boycotted and pushed to the wall. He notes that the young men of London who were enlisting were overjoyed at the prospect of going to war. Now imagine that. What gets people in such a stupor to welcome and glorify war? And that's a world without Christ, yeah? So from here, Bartleman took his family into Liverpool, and he stayed a few days preaching in local missions until finally boarding the ship named St. Paul back to New York. He arrived back in America 7 days later on the 30th of October 1914. Although he realised the wisdom in getting his family out of Europe, he longed to go back there again and once again return to the mission field. Now, Frank Bartleman documented every single cent of provision sent by brothers and sisters from all over the world, and with a grand total of $1,434.02 throughout the entire trip, he entered back into America with $2 in his pocket, which I'm going to say again is about the same price as the ebook. So go to the iPhone ebooks and go and buy this book. Now from New York, Frank made his way north on the East Coast for a bit of time before finally heading back to Los Angeles, preaching along the way in many, many missions. One of the last things he writes is that he had been seemingly inactive for 10 years, which would make it sort of late 1924, early 1925, which, common sense. It's the year that this book was published. Now, his very last thought was a request that the reader prays that he would be able to go back one more time and that he had no other interest in any other matter. Now, he never did go back, and he later died in 1936 at the age of 64. He wrote 6 books, he helped with 3 others, and he wrote out hundreds of gospel tracts. For how little he's spoken of, his impact for the gospel and the Pentecostal movement was way up there. And after reading and knowing him to be a humble man, it really is a disservice for how little recognition he gets amongst most messages on Azusa Street, even though in his humility that would have been his will. So what's the takeaways from this episode? Okay, the big point is humility and a heart for the lost is paramount in any revival. Revival is a gradual build-up and not something that happens in a random instance. It was a continual season of prayer and fasting by men who were willing to serve wherever they were called. Once it comes, it is a constant continuation of mission work, obedience, faith, and trust in God for all things in all moments. But there's also another side. It also shows, and this is point 2, it also shows that not everyone is called to be a missionary. However, if you hear that call from God, don't ignore it. And I'm well aware that comment might come back to bite me one day. But go into the mission field fully trusting in God's provision. You'll know very quickly if you are indeed called into that ministry, and whilst you may doubt it sometimes, God will confirm it for you. Now, another thing that I notice is point 3. Another thing I notice is the mission field is not a holiday, okay, nor is it a carefully mapped out journey designed to avoid dangerous areas. It's literally being Daniel in the midst of hungry lions, right? It's not for new converts whose faith has not yet been tested. It's for seasoned believers who are not afraid of the danger that might come, but are well aware that God is able to bring them through that unscathed, if it be his will. Now, in point 4, another thing that I've taken away from this myself, which I'm sure many have heard from Pentecostal pulpits before, is that we don't need to understand God's plan before we go. We go in obedience. The next thing that I've taken away from this episode is the Pentecostal movement was not about the gift of tongues, not in the slightest. Like, there's no mention of tongues in this book, despite it being the focus today, right? The Pentecostal movement was a mission field with men and women in some cases willing to go around the world with no provision of their own in faith to share the gospel. There are many praying for revival today to break out, right? But firstly, are we willing to humble ourselves and seek holiness before it comes? And when it comes, is there anyone willing to go out into the missions field and face the lion's den? And number 6, lastly, as I said in the second takeaway, not everyone is called to be a missionary, okay? Now, I was severely convicted researching for this episode to the point that I started thinking, if revival broke out here, would I go into the lion's den? However, if every person in this movement did exactly that, there would be no churches, right? Because the church would get planted, and there needs to be people to remain in the church. So not everybody is called to the missions field, right? So if I've written it a different way, but I'm going to speak it differently. So if missionaries planted churches, and then every single one of those congregants became a missionary and went out, then what you end up with is a massive group of brand new converts who really only know the gospel going out and sharing just the gospel. And that's great. But we still need discipleship, right? You still need teachers. You still need pastors. You still need elders. You still need people helping you to live the Christian life, right? Now, look, I found myself needing a reminder, right, of that very thing. Now, look, while most of these men that we look at are inspirational, right, not everyone can do what they did. And if we're one of the people that can't, there's no shame or condemnation in that, right? It just so happened as well that this verse was preached on in my church while I was thinking about this 3 days ago. Okay, and the timing of God just can't be faulted. It was 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 6 to 7, and it says, I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither is he that plants anything, neither he that waters, but God that gives the increase. Not everyone plants a seed, right? But when it's planted, there needs to be watering, which comes in the form of teaching and discipleship. So it's important that we hear the call of God, that we heed the call of God, and that we play our roles with the grace that God has given us to do so. A lot of these men and women that we'll look into throughout the series were evangelists, okay? They were gifted by God to go forth with a message. We could even say that they were small a apostles, right? Which is just means sent ones in the Greek, because they were sent with a message. Now, I'm still really enjoying researching this movement, as you can probably tell from how long each episode is going for and how long they're taking to get out. One thing I said to Nick during the week is I don't read books, but for some reason now I read books. So, I'm really, really enjoying the research. It is draining. It's been a lot of late nights reading because I just don't want to put the books down. And the more I read, the more I want to write. The more I write, the more I want to read. So it's, I'm just loving what God's doing in my life. But it has caused me to kind of neglect the scriptures a bit, and I need to get back into that. So the next episode may even take a little bit more time out to get out than what this one has. And you might also notice that I've only really promoted the quote-unquote success stories or the good side of this history. But there is also another side. And we're going to get into that in the next episode. So I'm sorry to leave you all hanging, but hey, I've got to keep you coming back somehow, right? So I'll catch you later, guys and girls. God bless you all and be safe. Peace.